Hi, welcome to MexElects again. Today we're going to finish off our crib sheets series with the final installment. We're going to talk about how did we get this way? I mean, how did the political system evolve in the way that it did in Mexico? How did the economy change in the ways that it has? And all of that, really, we have to go back to the beginning, to the period after the revolution when the PRI have established their hegemony or their dominance of the political system. So let's start with that, Kurt. What happened in those decades after the revolution?
Yeah, so after the revolution, the PRI sets up basically a one-party state, a state of one-party hegemony, as you mentioned. And they kind of set up a sort of Faustian bargain with the Mexican population, in the sense of, you know, you're not going to get political democracy, but you are going to get some degree of a welfare state. So the PRI set up nationalized education with a free textbook system, set up different setups of healthcare system, pensions, a system of grants and scholarships for art and culture that was the best in Latin America, and a university system that had a lot of people from Latin America coming to Mexico to study. So, you know, there was something being gotten there for all the oil wealth that Mexico had.
Sure. So a kind of modern liberal welfare state, but not a lot in the way of broad democratic participation. So tell us, I mean, the economy begins to change in the 1980s as almost all of the major industrial or developed and less developed economies changed during that period toward neoliberalism, freeing up the market, beginning to cut back on those social provisions. That begins in the 80s.
Yeah, but just before that, too, this kind of Faustian bargain begins to fray with 1968, with the students' movement sweeping around the world, Mexico City. And the PRI under Díaz Ordaz makes very clear, if you want democracy, we'll kill you. Then you get to the early 80s, and you get the peso crisis in 1982, which is a great pretext to sell off the state, which is what happened in the 80s and 90s. So you had a wholesale privatization of the Mexican state. Now, it didn't happen overnight, like in Chile with Pinochet. It was drop by drop. But over time, you had over 1,000 government agencies privatized, the airlines sold off, pensions privatized, railways gone, thanks to Cedillo. And you get a privatization of the Mexican state hand in hand in the 1990s with NAFTA, which opens up Mexico to unfair competition to American subsidized agribusiness. So it leads to the devastation of the countryside, increases immigration, as the Clinton administration knew full well, which is why they beefed up border security at the same time as NAFTA. And Mexico becomes basically a very dependent, prostrate state. Back in the early 80s, we're talking about a country that was the fourth largest oil producer in the world. Now, because they haven't built refineries and have to refine their oil in the United States, Mexico just has 5 days of reserves. If the United States wanted to turn off the spigots, you know, how can you be an independent country if you don't have independence with regards to food and energy?
Okay, so we get to the 1990s. There are some pretty spectacular social rebellions, like the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas on the eve of the beginning of the North American Free Trade Agreement. But it's not just the Zapatista uprising. There are a whole range of new social movements that are beginning to put pressure on the state, challenge the state, challenge not just the state politically, but around all the economic issues that you've talked about. That brings us to 2000, where there's a supposed movement toward democratization, and the first election where a non-PRI party is elected to power. So tell us from that point what happened.
Sure. So the 2000 election was a great, remarkable PR move by the Mexican state. There was a sort of simulated transition between two right-wing parties, the PRI and the PAN, Vicente Fox, an ex-Coca-Cola executive, you know, with cowboy boots and the like. But really nothing changed. Because ideologically the parties have practically merged. That's why I talk about the PRIAN. It was a pacted transition between two right-wing parties. And the same corporatist system of the PRI not only continued, but it got further entrenched by the PAN, who, thinking they only had maybe a shorter period of time in power, they certainly don't have the 80 years of the PRI, they had to steal more quickly.
Yeah. Okay. So then we have, one PAN presidency, Vicente Fox, as you mentioned. Then we have the second PAN presidency in Felipe Calderon, and he initiates in 2006 the drug war. And, most people think of the drug war as not being a particularly political thing, and yet it has deeply political meaning in Mexico. So let's talk about the function of the drug war.
Sure. So, first of all, the first political aspect of the drug war, which Calderon never mentioned during his campaign, was to legitimize himself in power, because it was a disputed election with very substantiated allegations of electoral fraud in 2006. So that was the first function. The second function is, you've gotten to the point where the effervescence of Mexican society can't be stopped any other way, with the typical simulations of the Mexican state. So the drug war is a great way to get the military out in the streets, to militarize the country, to instill fear in the population, to really curb participation in the political process. To the point now where you have the interior security law, where now the army is facilitated to take on police functions within the state. So,
and that's recent, right? I mean, that's in the last 2 months.
And is being appealed to the Supreme Court. So, Mexico has suffered over the years we've talked about, and there's a lot more to mention, a real 1-2 punch of grueling austerity plus the drug war, the kind of Colombianization of Mexico, if you want to talk about that, which has really torn away at the social fabric of the state and made meaningful political participation not only difficult but also very dangerous in certain places.
Okay, well, that puts a lot of different things in perspective. So thanks very much.